Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Imperial College's Centre for Languages, Culture, Communication. We've got a special research seminar today. We have these events, I think, fortnightly, where staff members and visiting speakers talk about their research, their work, and their publications, and so on. And it's a great pleasure today to host Jane Tippett's visit. So Jane Tippett is a historian and an archivist. She graduated from University of Delaware with a BA in French History and English Literature. She received her MSc in History of Art from Wadham College, Oxford, where she wrote her dissertation on the centrality of provenance in the contemporary fine art auction market. Since graduating, she has worked as a consultant archivist and fine arts curator to high net worth families in New York City, Boston, London, and Paris. She currently lives in New York. Once a King, The Lost Memoir of Edward VIII is her first book. And it's a great pleasure to be hosting her today. Jane, I look forward to talking with you, but as a historian, I have a PhD in history. Some of you know me. I lead the humanities, social science education field here at Imperial. And it's a pleasure to welcome a fellow historian here. Thank you for joining us. And we were thinking one way to start this off is it's very hard to encapsulate the literature on the royal family, and particularly the former Edward VIII, later Duke of Windsor, easily. I think that the best way to convey what I'm feeling like at the moment as a historian is usually when you read history books about important events, they're many years after the fact, and even revelatory accounts they've had 30 years more research done on them, so they feel like they've accumulated into this historiographical sediment. Yeah, they don't seem so astonishing anymore. What is really exciting to me about Jane being here and her book being published is we get to be here in the moment when the history and the historiography of this subject changes. Yeah, in 50 years' time, it will be obvious that this book came out and that people started using it and its sources and thinking afresh about this subject. We have the privilege, both live and online, to be able to be here in the moment at which this is new. Yeah, and I would love for you to reflect on this both now in the conversation for the rest of the day and beyond. So thank you for joining us. And the way Jane and I met was actually at Imperial College here. She kindly got in contact with me one day. So I work on history of science and technology. My PhD was on the history of management consulting and its relations with technology implementation. In particular, I was working with a gentleman named Charles E. Beddoe, who was one of the world's pioneering management consultants, died in 1944. But he hosted the wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor at his French chateau in 1937. And so Jane emailed me to get in touch about any sources I might have, because she was thinking very broadly and very interestingly about a subject which has received huge attention, but in very specific ways. And what I admired immediately about Jane's work is her ability to think more broadly, to think outside the box, and to find really novel and innovative ways and sources of addressing this subject. So Jane, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now let's go on to some of the topics we were talking about. Why don't you talk us through, in the book you mentioned the revelatory experience of reading a few footnotes and then realizing there may be some huge historical finds.
Well, I mean, I came to this material in it was in a very simple way. When I met you, I was working on a different subject about Edward. I was looking at the year of 1937 and thinking about the ways in which he dealt with the 12 months following the abdication, which most famously culminated in his trip to Germany in October 1937. And what I hope is a good historian does, we're constantly looking for ways and means of accessing different new material to add something to the narrative. And I came across a source note for the Duchess of Windsor's ghostwriter, who was named as Cleveland Amory. And I immediately knew that Amory had only been her ghostwriter for a few months, but this biographer claimed to have sort of found the trove of the ghostwriter's sources. So I thought, well, what about the other ghostwriter, the real ghostwriter, the ghostwriter that worked with Edward and then subsequently with Wallace? And that was Charles J.V. Murphy. And it was not a terribly glamorous research mission. I Googled and found that his papers were at Boston University at the Howard Gottlieb Research Center, and went up and visited it. And immediately, I mean, I think it's that moment when you understand you've found something very special, even if you don't quite understand what you're going to do with it. And it was clear that this was something incredible. I mean, it was almost a case where, surely this has been quoted somewhere. Surely I've just missed a citation. It wasn't. And I knew I had a different book to write and to really make use of this material, which I think opens a new window onto the Windsors.
Thank you, Jane. So for those who have not yet read your book, could you describe the texture and the nature of the sources that you found?
Sure. So the book is a compilation of Edward's first drafts of his memoir. So most people think of that as a King's story, which was published in 1951. In fact, the genesis of the memoir was a series of articles that he wrote for Life magazine, first in 1947, they were published in 1947, and then in 1951. It was only after that period that the memoir the book memoir took shape in a really a short period of time, from the summer of 1950 when it was and then published in April 1951. And in the interim, he had spent years working on drafts of his memoir with his ghostwriter Murphy. And he began by saying that he wanted to create an unexpurgated book, a book that he would say everything, that he would leave no stone unturned, but of course wasn't appropriate for publication. And from that material, he would then draw forth the published articles. And so he spent this long time drafting text on all aspects of his life, his family, his experiences in the First World War, his experiences in the 1920s in British society, his travels throughout the empire, which took place between 1919 and 1925. So what I've done with the book is take obviously a selection of that material. I didn't have room for all of it. I've taken a selection of that material, reproduced it alongside my editorial voices. But with that is when Murphy reemerges to the Windsors to help the Duchess of Windsor. Now, the Duchess was not a writer. She was not drafting her texts. So Murphy employed a different tactic. He interviewed her, recorded the interviews, and then from that took her words and started drafting chapters. So the book really closes with her words, which I couldn't include everything. I chose on the basis of how they spoke to Edward's material. And so you have her then commenting on many of the things that the Duke is reflecting on in this material.
Thank you, Jane. So, I mean, from our conversations about your wonderful work, on the one hand, this is a familiar research story. There's a well-known person, you find a trove of papers or documents or films or photos or something somewhere, and then you publish them, and then they get added into the broader historical work on that subject. But what's fascinating about this is it seems unusual in the context of the Duke of Windsor and the work that's published about him. For those who've touched on this subject, and the 20th century British royals, it's a very unusual subject. Normally, you get all the books at the library, British Library, perhaps. You sit with them and you read them all, and then you know all the stuff that exists, right? And then you think, well, where are the gaps in the literature? What sources do I have that's different? How does that change the story? With the story on the Duke of Windsor particularly, but the mid-20th century royals, there is a very strange kind of eternal circle that keeps going through it. I don't know how many of you know, but there's been, for example, directly in relation to the Duke, there was a series of forgeries put in the UK National Archives, which is not just important for the royal family, I'm sure, but also for just historians to realize that people have put forgeries into the UK National Archives, when usually they unfortunately take things out and sell them. Which obviously you shouldn't do, but what I loved about this work and your approach to it when we first met, it was just realizing you were trying to break the cycle. There's a lot of hearsay, a lot of citations, and when you go back to the original source, it's kind of not there, or it said something different, or it was quoting someone else, and you wouldn't normally see this in other literature. So I was just, as you were researching and writing, just how did you almost manage to surface this into the realm of almost normal history research and writing?
Well, hopefully it's because I have I hope a background in normal history writing. I mean, I was taught, I think at the beginning of my academic life, I mean, if you're going to write about something, write something that's adding to the body of literature about it, say something new, draw forth a new argument, obviously based though on primary material, on your research. And I think what's so interesting about conversations about the Duke of Windsor, and to a certain extent, the broader discussions about 20th century century, the 20th century British royal family, is that people have ideas about him, but are not quite sure why they have them. They have drawn conclusions about his character. They've drawn conclusions about his political affiliations and sympathies. And yet, if you go back to them and say, well, why actually do you believe that? Why do you think this? And they're hard pressed for a sort of clear historical genesis of how they've come to this very sort of fixed idea of him. And for me, I think what's interesting about this material is it forces us to broaden the perspective, to broaden the discussion, to think about him in the round. I think, he's a very much a one-dimensional historical figure. In fact, I don't even think he's dealt with as a historical figure. The way we would talk about, say, Churchill, de Gaulle. I mean, I think one of the very interesting things about the reception of this book has been, I think people are reading it and coming and writing about Edward. The review is about Edward as a person versus what is the review of this book? What is the review of the material, and how does this material add to the conversation? It's more just that this is my review of who Edward was as a person, which remain a very, I think, simplistic and unsophisticated conversation based on, was he a good guy? Was he a bad guy? These are not questions we usually ask about historical figures. Was he good? Was he bad? We're interested in understanding them in the historical fabric and how they affect their moment and why we should look at them.
Thank you, Jane. I mean, that raises an important question. Why, in my own studies, I studied the Tudors and Edward VIII and legal changes and the Victorians and all these kind of things. These are taken very seriously. And as you say, that people aren't moralizing, they're trying, historical debates, discovery, sources, fitting into different modes of analysis and so on. Why do you think it is that the 20th century monarchy, if that's true, is studied differently somehow from all of the previous centuries of the monarchy? I
mean, I think right now the discussions on 20th century British royals, particularly say from the 1930s onwards, it's done by royal historians and correspondents who themselves are invested in the institution, who their professional lives, their careers remain heavily invested in supporting the institution. And I think what that renders is this conversation around who was good and who was a wonderful leader, who was a wonderful monarch, who was to be admired. These are simplistic narratives. I think there's a resistance, not a resistance, but I think there's a lack of interest by these historians and commentators at looking at harder, more difficult questions about the role of monarchy in 20th century British society, how it functions as still a political institution, how it shapes the fabric of British culture. Those kinds of questions are not being promoted by, again, royal historians, commentators, because I think those questions don't serve the sustenance of the institution itself.
Thank you. Yeah, it also reminds me of for example, the work of my former supervisor, David Edgerton, who used to be based at Imperial College. So you said, the 20th century is described in terms of narratives, decline of Britain, or which people say something about France, for example, de Gaulle, the rise of XYZ, the rise of a democratic society, a more sort of media-focused society, and so on. And as you say, the monarchy falls between the gaps here, because you have people writing about the history of politics, which means the history of the House of Commons, usually, sometimes with the Lords, sometimes local politics, but not the monarchy. And then you have people writing the history of the state, which means the civil service, the military, and maybe local government, and so on, research, R&D, universities. But even though the monarch is the head of state, the monarchy doesn't fit into the history of the state either. So you have two huge bodies of literature there. It's great stuff. I love learning this myself. And the monarchy falls between the cracks.
I think the conversation becomes more in the vein of a kind of celebrity culture, the tabloid culture. So it becomes about narratives of, obviously family crises, family dysfunctions, marital dysfunctions. There's an entertainment factor, of course. And so we focus on that. I think, or the conversation focuses on that rather than these serious questions about how monarchy functions. How is a monarch, talking about say the monarch that we just, you just lost, what was her role as a leader, as a leader of British society? What was her impact? I think, those conversations just aren't taking place in a meaningful way. And therefore, I think what happens with the Duke of Windsor is obviously in this narrative, it becomes he is the black sheep. He is the bad guy. We're not, okay, whether you like him or you dislike him, that's something, first of all, I wanted to avoid in the book. What's interesting about him is his role in the monarchy, whether or not he was a good guy or bad guy. He has an impact on the history of 20th century monarchy. He shapes it, both his work as Prince of Wales, but of course the abdication, the defining event in the evolution of 20th century monarchy. And yet there's this resistance to talking about him as a serious historical figure. And again, thinking about the sort of the reception of the book, I think, for me, I've been surprised that just by writing the book, the interpretation is that I'm an apologist for him. And I think that's a misreading. That's a misinterpretation of the project.
Interesting. Thank you. I mean, there's a lot of people in the room who are very specialist in analyzing the media. So hopefully we can develop that as part of the discussion. Something you mentioned in an interview with the Telegraph, a comparison between the present king, Charles III, and interestingly enough, with Edward VIII, which is not a comparison most people would usually make. So could you talk us through that you're thinking there?
Well, I think that's not a comparison usually made because it's not one that contemporary royal commentators and historians know would do them very much good in the eyes of the current monarch. Would not be read as a favorable comparison. But I think there are several salient ones. I mean, first of all, few people remark on the fact that the biggest thing that allies the two men is that they wish to remain king and marry a divorced woman. One did it more successfully than the other. I think they also have pioneered, of course, as Prince of Wales, this distinction between public and private sphere, between having a private life, but also, that's separate from your public duties. I think Charles's interest in, I believe, slimming down the monarchy, making it at least from, I think, from a media perspective, look slimmer, look more efficient, is something that Edward as well was concerned about. I think he saw that times were changing. He felt that the monarchy of his parents felt outmoded in the kinds of worlds he had circulated in, both in the empire, but also in Britain, where he had seen, he'd seen how many other types of people lived, and I think he felt it was out of step with it. So I think there are comparisons. I'd also say, I mean, to maybe push it even a bit further, one of the first great criticisms of Edward VIII is that he put his duty, his role as a monarch, his role as a royal behind that of his personal inclinations. And I think if we stretch our minds back to the 90s, I think for longer periods of time that happened with many contemporary royals, where personal inclinations certainly became the main topic of conversation for a much longer period of time than the 10 days of the abdication.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, because I think the more obvious comparison due simply to the tell-all memoir formats would be with Prince Harry, right?
Yes, which I sort of resist, because I think, they're on very different tracks. They're very different. First of all, the memoirs themselves were very different projects. Edward wrote his memoir as an account of his royal life, which is one of the big differences between what was published and what was published in 1950 and 51 and what I've published here. The material here was not meant for public consumption. It was part of, as we say, this unexpurgated book. And he did not see his book as a sort of as a tell-all of his private life, of his family, whatever bitterness, and there was a great deal of bitterness on both sides. He did not think that it was the place for that airing of those feelings. His real interest, apart from the money that he made, was the fact that he wanted a record of his royal life. He wanted to put down his work as Prince of Wales. He also wanted to put down his time as king. He felt embarrassment, I think, about neither. And he believed that he wanted to leave a record. I think Prince Harry's memoirs is a much more, we're dealing in the emotional world. This is a memoir, it's a journey of his mental health, of his personal life. He's had such a limited royal life, of course, only a few years. So, and I think I don't want to speculate on his motivations. I think his rationale behind the memoir, it's very different reasons. There's a very different perspective on what he's hoping to gain from that sort of text.
Interesting, thank you. I mean, I think something that will be interesting and perhaps not obvious to everyone. I mean, as I say, when historical knowledge accumulates over time, it kind of compresses together. And it's only when you sit down and look at the dates of certain, publications or TV shows or interviews, you can sometimes see a pattern. And the pattern that Jane and I, we were drawing up a kind of timeline just for us to look at. And what's really striking when you look at the timeline of significant events in relation to the Edward VIII in particular, but tying it into the royal family, is there's a big gap after World War II, like a really big one. You have huge events, the abdication, the marriage in 1937. You have a slew of activity in 1945 at the end of World War II. Between those, there's particular events in relation to Edward and others, but which maybe we'll talk about. But after that, the situation gets very quiet. It's not until, what was it, 1974. There's a biography of Edward. So 2 years he had died.
Yes, Francis Donaldson, which, I mean, it remains, I think, a very sort of solid text about his life. And that was 2 years after he died. I would add that in 1979, Charles Murphy actually collaborated on a book about the Windsors called The Windsor Story. And I think it's interesting about that book because he did not do the writing, his collaborator Brian did, but I think that's one of the reasons, and we've talked about this, why this material has been sort of overlooked, is because, supposedly Murphy had sort of said everything he had to say in this book, a book that I think at the time he was very concerned about the potential liabilities of NDAs, et cetera. So it didn't say everything as we know. And then there's a long dry spell in the literature until Philip Ziegler publishes the official biography, and just to give a little context, the official biography is the biography that he would have had the royal family basically agree to, and therefore he has access to papers previously not seen before. And since that publication, which is in 92, we have had no full biography of Edward. There has been there's been episodic moments, looking at the abdication, the time in, his supposed German affiliations, but there's been no sort of attempt to look at his life in whole again. And I think that's a very interesting omission. In all of these kind of Windsor books that pop up, there's not a serious, we've had 30 years since that biography. No one is interested in, again, looking at him in the round and thinking about his life when all sorts of archives material has come up again.
Thank you. Well, hopefully everyone here today and looking online is interested in this.
Yeah.
And just again, to tie it into broader stories, I mean, I'm thinking of the work of, for example, Philippe Sands and others on the generational impact of World War II. I mean, you find, and this is, you look at the literature on Vichy France, on Germany, there's a new TV series on post-war Germany. And the not even necessarily active suppression, but the sincere desire to avoid talking about what had gone in the 30s and the early 40s, to get on with life, because life, it had been highlighted to a lot of people, was very short, and just let bygones be bygones and move on. And I don't know who those of you know this, but there's work coming out now by people. So my grandparents were active in World War II, as it were. So and sometimes, for example, I mentioned Philippe Sands. He studied the children of senior German officers, and they split one way or the other. Either my father has been misrepresented in the literature, or my father, I can't believe I'm related to this horrible person. It takes the grandchildren, which is generation we're of, to really just say, can we just treat this like a historical subject? And that's only coming now. This, in something I wrote recently, I said, this kind of work is truly post-war, because we're not addressing it with choosing sides in World War II in mind. And that, I think, has been, I think your training background, but also just the generational moment in which we find ourselves makes the research questions different. Yeah.
I think we see, we're less emotionally invested in I think the period where, we have a different sort of set of memories related to the Second World War. And I think we do probably see it dispassionately. We see it hopefully with more objectivity. I think there's again this danger of the idea of apologists. And that somehow to write about someone like Edward, who obviously has some uncomfortable associations, and to take him seriously as an individual is somehow trying to set yourself up as an apologist for him, to look at him naively, which I just think is, again, a sort of simplification of methodology.
And that we would, if you wrote a biography of Stalin, no one would say you're apologizing somehow to Stalin.
Is he a good guy or is he a bad guy?
Yeah.
I mean, we would think someone is writing a rather ridiculous and simplistic biography, and yet this is exactly the type of questions that have already arisen about this book. You know, it doesn't matter if I like or dislike him. Is there an importance to Edward in the history of the 20th century monarchy? Is there something to be learned historically from his life? And I think there is. And of course, his words, the fact that this book is built on his words gives us a new insight into whether or not we agree with his perspective. That's not what's at issue here. It's so we understand his perspective again. We get a glimpse of what that was. And
thank you. And again, with the generational thing, you mentioned in the book that it's important to remember that the Duke and Duchess had no children. And therefore, and not other people to inherit their mantle and to protect and develop their reputation, as it were. Even it may be, too positive, too negative, develop a reputation, but in this case, they've got nobody stewarding.
And I think there's a real correlation between their deaths and the emergence of this material that has promoted these sensationalist allegations about their political views, which now have just been accepted into fact. They built up over the course of, say, the late 90s through to the current day. There's people are still actively engaged in this kind of work. And so now they're to a point that they are embedded in how people perceive them. Again, to just reiterate what I said, people who they've come to these conclusions about the Windsors, but they don't exactly know why. They can't unpack it. They can't tell you why. And obviously something like The Crown is just kind of what I see that as a sort of apotheosis of, this is the ultimate moment where all of these cultural sort of threads have come together to build this portrait. And I think, it's a mistake in history when we do that. And hopefully in some ways, this is not just this is a corrective text. That's how I'd like to see it.
Thank you. So, I mean, there's also, you mentioned in the book, on the one hand, we ought to discuss the particular events that lead to particular reputations now. However, we don't want to actively amplify them by accident. Do you see what I mean? To continue a distorted version of history. So why don't just to mention the two particular events that the Duke is connected to, you can mention that, but also how you've addressed them, you grappled with them in this book.
I mean, obviously, the one that everyone knows about, which really gives kind of the foundation of these allegations that he had fascist or pro-German sympathies, is the fact that he went to Germany in October of 1937. How I met Michael.
We didn't go in 1937.
We didn't go in 1937, but we felt we did. His trip was organized by Charles Bedeau, who had hosted his wedding in his home in the Loire Valley, the Chateau Condé. Bedeau, we can't go into it. Basically, I think persuaded the Duke that he had the makings of a new royal career on hand. Mm-hmm. He was going to travel the world as a sort of international roving ambassador, shining a light on housing conditions, social welfare, particularly allied to countries that were trying to, of course, recover from the Great Depression. Alongside this is something not many people know. In the mix of these people who were encouraging the Duke of Windsor to do this was Thomas Watson, who was the founder of IBM, who had himself been to Germany in the summer of 1937. He not only had tea with Hitler, but he received a German distinction for his economic contribution to the German state. And he had lunch with the Duke of Windsor while honeymooning with Charles Bedeau, and thought this was a great idea. And so the Duke is really, I think, encouraged by this new circle that he finds himself in after the abdication, to think that he can go and he can make a difference. And of course, Bedeau at the same time is setting up a trip to America, the other major industrial leading nation, to also do the same thing, look at housing conditions. When they planned to go to Germany, they had not planned to meet Hitler. That was not part of the original itinerary. They didn't know until about 2 days before, and had to sort of reroute to Berchtesgaden. They met with him for about 3 hours, the Duke too. He had an interpreter with them. They had a tea and they left. And this, of course, has now become one of the, apart from the abdication, the defining moment in Edward's life. And I think, I think it's so difficult on so many levels. I mean, firstly, you have to contextualize Edward's trip within the 1930s. First of all, it was before Kristallnacht, which is a defining, I think a lot of historians look at that as sort of a juncture in how you understand and believe that you could work with Germany. And so this is before Kristallnacht. Edward is also following in the steps of people like Lloyd George, who had visited Hitler, again, a tea time visit in Berchtesgaden in September of 1936. And when you read the kind of the article in the Times reporting on the visit, it's for exactly almost the same reason that Edward is going, to learn about what's happening in the German economy and get a better picture. But of course, there are these photographs of their leaving. These have now become iconic. Edward, for various reasons, does not go to the United States, which was to take place 2 weeks later. If he had, he would have had another picture, which I think would have been famous, which would have been him with FDR at the White House and with Eleanor Roosevelt walking around the housing settlement she had created in Greenbelt, Maryland. I think if we imagine those moments in comparison with Hitler, I think that would recontextualize it in a very helpful way. But that didn't happen. So we have this imagery around this trip to Germany that unfortunately then collides with, again, much too complicated for the scope of this talk, but a period in 1940 when the Duke and Duchess were in Lisbon. They had fled France from the German invasion. They escaped first through Spain and then were in Portugal awaiting passage to the Bahamas. And there's a series of telegrams between German officials and Ribbentrop that allege the Duke had, at that point, pro-appeasement, pro-peace views. He supposedly said that there should be a separate peace with Germany by this point. Britain should have a peace with Germany. I mean, the problem with, so what happened with these telegrams is that they were part of the German files of the German Foreign Ministry that were recovered in 1945 after the Allied occupation of Germany. For about a decade, I think longer than a decade, they were worked on by historians and published as it was it was a French, British, and American group of historians. And these telegrams report these conversations that the Duke had in Lisbon with German agents, one of whom was his host, who had been selected for him by the British ambassador in Lisbon, Sir Walford Selby. And supposedly these conversations, which were reported back to a Portuguese minister, who reported back to a German minister, who were reported back to Ribbentrop, are damning allegations that the Duke was pro-Hitler, pro-German. And, when I was grappling with this material in this book, it was one of the most kind of vexatious chapters, just because it's so complicated, these telegrams, figuring out exactly who he was supposedly speaking to, who it was going back to. Unpicking these telegrams was this troublesome moment, because it's so complex and it's so ambiguous. And but unfortunately what's happened is those telegrams have now been vastly simplified, because to understand them in the full is so complicated. And they formed part of this narrative that the Duke wished for a peace with Germany, and by extension, that peace would have meant he would have been returned as king. This is the jump that people have made with this material. And it's very effective when you can then, as a commentator talks, flash and have pictures of the Duke in Germany meeting Hitler, even though, of course, those events take place 4 years before. There's no context given to why the Duke was in Germany. But as you're talking about this period in Lisbon, in sweeping generalizations, you have this great body of imagery, which I think has been very effective and used very effective and in sensational ways to make the case to the extent that I think people who should have a broader sense of the history have accepted these as facts.
I mean, what yet another thing I think your book's really strong on is analyzing the reception to these revelations in the 1950s. With you citing Eisenhower and Churchill both saying these are not revelations, they don't damn the Duke in any respect. Yeah. And yet we don't believe Eisenhower and Churchill on this.
Not even Eisenhower. John Winnet comes into the conversation. He was the American ambassador in London, and he was one of the American men in London pressing FDR to get on the side of Britain, to help Britain as much as they can. So there was no question that he would be an apologist for Germany. Winnet, and Eisenhower tells Churchill, Winnet had seen this material when it first emerged, dismissed it. Eisenhower dismissed it. Alan Dulles, the first head of the CIA, also had seen the material. He dismissed it. And so I think what's very interesting about it at the time, when this comes out, though of course it's noticed, and I think, Murphy himself is like, oh, this is like another case of the Duke's naive political judgment, which I think is spot on. I think it's so interesting to see the way contemporaries, but not just contemporaries, important men of the time were looking at these telegrams and sort of just thinking, this is like ridiculous. This is pro-German propaganda. This is, of course, the German minister is going to report favorably to Ribbentrop. That's exactly what they want to hear. And in a great, I want, just because we've lost Murphy a little bit in this conversation, it's so important. He really is the narrator of this book. He's the way into all of these subjects, because, not only was he there facilitating these drafts, conversations, he himself is commenting actively on it throughout his work with the Windsors, writing in his diary, writing letters. He was a wonderful, wonderful letter writer, had an incredible voice, and thinking about these people that he was engaged with. And he just also feels like he's everywhere all the time. And when this material surfaces, he's yet again hanging around with the Windsors, working with Wallace and commenting on it, and also seeing their reactions to it. And he sees the Duke a day after the first set of this material has come out, and everything is fine. I mean, he basically considers it, that's dealt with. It's not a big deal. And he's like interested in his gardening samples he brought back from London. I mean, and I think that gives us an interesting perspective about how we should maybe rethink and relook at this material without all of this backlog of other people who've added their own voices and agendas on top of it,
while also making sure of the secondary historical questions you're asking, because sometimes once some of these narratives have solidified based on, as you mentioned, sometimes hearsay at the time, 3 layers of this, lies, forgeries, and so on. If you even go to the archive with these kinds of questions in mind, sometimes it can distort the research itself. So on the one hand, you need to read all of the literature so you know what it says. On the other hand, you kind of shouldn't read any of it and just write the stuff afresh, right?
I think a strange kind of, it's a strange sort of mix of the two. It is. Both.
Imperial College, we talk about the sociology of scientific knowledge. The sociology of historical knowledge here is really weird. It's not aggregating in the way it kind of would expect history to, and that's really distinctive, challenging, and interesting. Jane, I just think we're going for till 3, is that right? Yeah. So why don't we just do one more point now about the contemporary royals and discussion and so on, and then take some questions. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So you've had a great deal of reception in the newspapers and so in relation to and magazines in relation to your book, which is great. And I'm sure some of it you agree with it, and some maybe not. But what do you see? I mean, for example, the Duke of Windsor is mentioned in Harry's Spare, almost as a ghost. Yeah. How do you see the Duke of Windsor fitting into the current day royal family? What space does he fill in their public image, media, sort of communications, and so on?
Well, he's probably a convenient distraction, I think.
Okay.
I think that it's probably a convenient distraction from other topics of conversation that might be less they don't wish to focus on. I mean, I think he serves also, of course, all of the negativity, all of the kind of the judgments, I think, that are continually passed on him, they of course support this idea of the exceptional line that has survived in the British monarchy, that we have expunged the negative, we have, you know, we've gotten rid of that, and instead we've had, you know, we've had the right line, we've had the good line. So again, it's this sort of simplistic good versus bad narrative that I think fits well with what generates good headlines. That we got rid of the person who was delinquent, deviant in so many ways, and you know, we've kept Britain on the right course. I mean, it's so interesting. Several of the reviews have said, "Oh, we should feel so lucky that, you know, we got rid of this guy." And I mean, my sort of first response would be that if you know the history of Edward, most likely he could not have had children. He had had mums as a young man, and so he most likely would never have had children. You would still have gotten the Queen, just perhaps a little later. Perhaps it would have been in 1972 rather than in 52. But you would always, that line would have still been there. It would have been, of course, a different 20th century, a different monarchy. You'd have had a different kind of king. But this idea, I think, you know, that Britain was somehow saved. I mean, and we got the right queen for the right time. I guess, again, part of the myth.
It is, and just before we get to the question, you do even mention that I believe it was Cil Beaton who took the official photos of Elizabeth II. Is that right? Because of course he was the official photographer at the Duke and Duchess of Windsor's wedding in Condé in 1937.
Yeah.
And you speculate, you know, would Elizabeth II have chosen Cil Beaton as her official photographer in the 50s had she not have seen her uncle's pictures looking so amazing?
Well, I'd say even before that, I mean, that's such a fascinating moment. I'm glad you picked up on. So Beaton actually photographed them the day before their wedding. He came to Condé. He was very annoyed. He wasn't asked to stay the next day for the wedding. But he came, they dressed up in their clothes and did these hyper stylized images around Condé, extremely fashion images is what I call them. They were, talk about as far away from traditional royal portraiture as you could, wedding portraiture as you could ever get. They were this modern, romantic, chic couple that epitomized, well, Art Deco, 20th century modernity. And I think they were, I mean, they're beautiful images, extremely evocative, of course, of this romance that was now being played out in the media. They certainly fed into that idea. And what happens then, the Queen, it's actually the Queen's mother, Queen Elizabeth II's mother, who then brings Cecil Beaton to Buckingham Palace to take these photographs of her in the white wardrobe that was designed for a visit to France. And there are these romantic images. So instead of modernity, we have her almost as a Winterhalter painting, which of course Beaton was also very good at. It was amazing how you could pivot between the two. But they are these stylized versions of this dream of monarchy, of this romanticized portrait of what a queen would be wafting through the gardens in her palace with the tiara. And though, of course, stylistically different from the Windsors, the power of imagery is working in the same way. The language of the photograph is arguing for a type of monarchy. And I think, actually, I mean, there's a nice paper to write, which is how these images function as two different conversations about what monarchy in the 20th century should be. And we certainly see the monarchy of Edward VIII, the vision of modern, versus the vision of Queen Elizabeth and George VI, which of course harken back to Winterhalter, Victoria, the tradition, the continuity. So I think that the fact that she chose Beaton, this first time she'd ever been photographed by Beaton, and of course Beaton goes on to take the Queen Elizabeth II's coronation pictures, he effectively becomes the court photographer in all but name. I think the fact that she saw how powerful his images were of the Windsors, how he could articulate this kind of language in a visual way, was a selling point. So, and I do make in the point in the book, even as Edward is rejected and sort of, I think, rejected by the family, they copy him at various points. Stylistically, he is a trendsetter. He paves the way for how the royals adapt to their role as public figures in the 20th century.
Thank you, Jane. What a great way to summarize all these fascinating aspects of your book, which I'm sure everyone is looking forward to reading. We have a few moments now. Does anyone have any questions in the room? Can we do it online, Paul? Or
I think if you could repeat the first question.
Sure. Okay. So who's got the first question in the room? Greg.
You talk about the myth. Part of the myth that I grew up with was that animosity from the Queen Mother, because Edward forced her husband into a role. And so then you've got the destabilizing aspect of what they did. And now this, what you're talking about with Beaton, changing this image. I mean, how much do you think that in order to stabilize the monarchy, that the royal family were complicit in this idea of him as this loose cannon?
I think there is an element of complicity. I mean, it obviously suited, I think, the narrative that they needed, which was, of course, to stabilize the new king. And I mean, I think there was this deep anxiety about this rupture. Of course, it never happened. And one of the things we forget about the abdication is how unprecedented the abdication was. We're normalized. I mean, it just never had happened. So the shock of how do you cope in the aftermath with this? How do you the idea of monarchy is, a king dies, a new king is there. So how do you, when the foundation of the structure is challenged, how the structure works, how do you cope with it? I think there is an element of complicity. The royal family. I'd also say let's separate the royal family from the from courtiers, palace officials, actively sought to isolate the Windsors. I think one of the issues with the trip to Germany is that Edward was completely devoid of advice. People, his role as a Prince of Wales did not happen in a vacuum. He was surrounded by a team of advisors. He was given advice, even if he questioned it at times, which he did, which caused irritation. His life and his career was curated. And suddenly he is alone and he's not getting advice. I mean, the reaction of the news that he was going to Germany was something like, well, let's make sure nobody calls her an HRH. That was the most concern in the palace was, let's just not make sure no one from the embassy should meet them and do not call her a royal highness. That was the main message there. So I think they did isolate them. I think that they did, of course, think he was a loose cannon. I mean, the act of abdicating was the act of a loose cannon, for sure. And I think what's interesting, and I think about the Duke of Windsor, is that it's sort of evolved from an operation maybe that was primarily run from inside to actually now run by people who are writing about them. These journalists, historians, who I think have almost, taken up the mantle of keeping them on the outsider status. But I'd also say in terms of how the understanding of the Duke has been formed, it was very much formed by many of the courtiers who had known him in the 20s and 30s, who wrote about him in their diaries and left memorandum in the royal archives. There's one from Edward's private secretary in 1936 that, if you read through, which that was written in January of 1937, encapsulate many of the sort of now accepted views about him, who he was, his character. And so I think the inside was very important in setting the stage for how we were to think about him. But I think subsequently it's been taken up by others. But you're right, the Queen Mother as well. She was extremely bitter, I think, about.
Can I just follow up on this quickly?
Sure. Has anyone got a question? Go on then.
I'm just wondering, how does the Harry Oakes murder fit into this?
Aha.
He's accused of complicity in covering up the murder of Harry Oakes in Windsor, making industrialist in France, conniving with the right police. Now, is that part of a writer just using a villain, or is that part of the evidence that builds the case for the weak judgment?
I mean, that's not a period I cover in the book, because though there is material in this archive that relates to the Bahamas and to the Harry Oakes murder, for various editorial reasons, it was beyond the scope. I mean, I think that's another case in point where absence leaves room for speculation, and absence of information leaves open the possibility of inserting your own narrative. I mean, there certainly is, that the investigation was bungled. Of course, for people who know, he was a wealthy industrialist. Harry Oakes lived in the Bahamas, had homes in the Bahamas. and he was murdered. And the Duke, instead of relying on the police in the Bahamas, called in the police from Miami, and they ran the investigation. But it was a couple of days later. The scene had been totally interrupted, the murder scene, and no one was ever convicted. And it's seen as another of this kind of black mark on the Duke of Windsor, again, that he was complicit in it. And I think, again, it's more of the case where an absence then feeds into what makes a great story. I mean, I think that these stories that come up about Edward, I mean, they are riveting and they can create headlines. And when there isn't like a primary document that refutes it, it kind of leaves the speculation open, and someone can run wild with a good story that can be, I think, well told and well supported. Yeah.
Thank you. Who's got the next question? Yes.
I was going to say that I think he almost provides a bridge between the old monarchy and the newer monarchy, and the fact that he was only there for such a short while, in a way, played to that advantage. I mean, one thing I've actually only occurred to me recently, we tend not to think of it, is that he was really the first generation to be a Windsor, pretty much, because his father had been a South Coburg-Gotha, and they rebranded themselves during the First World War. So he was himself rebranded at a relatively young age.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that he carried with him a lot of the sense that he had to almost reinvent the monarchy because he was part of that process.
I thank you. I've never thought quite about how maybe the effect of that rebranding moment, the renaming, how actively he would have thought of his name as Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. I'm not sure, but it certainly was, from a media standpoint, a shift in the monarchy. I mean, I certainly think he did take on the mantle of rebranding the monarchy. I think he thought it was necessary. I think his experiences in the First World War propelled him to that conclusion that that things had shifted, class structures had shifted, that he could not assume. I mean, I think he calls it at one point the top-hatted monarchy of my grandfather. That he saw that as outmoded, and people talk about him as someone who risked the foundation of the institution, that had no care for it, and yet he spent really 2 decades caring for it. And I think what the material shows is that he was actively engaged in his role as Prince of Wales and in sustaining that role, and of course the institution of the monarchy for the future. He was so concerned with the rebranding of his style, with the rebranding of his duties, not just because I think he preferred not to go around so formal, but because he saw this as the way to a future. And so this narrative that happens is that he had no care for the institution, he disregarded it. I think that's not supported when you look at the body of his role as a working royal, which again, I think that's something that no one does want to look at with him, because it forces us into areas that don't necessarily agree with the accepted conclusions about him.
Thank you. Time for one final point or question. Right at the back, Alfred.
I just wanted to ask what it felt like to work so long on the biography of the death. It's always fascinating. What has it felt like as a project for you, as a writer afterwards?
Oh, the end of the book.
Yeah.
So the question is, how did it feel for you as a writer to write about someone who long died?
Well, I think the material. Well, I think in this material they certainly don't feel dead. In the sense that there are the voices in the material, not just Edward's, Wallace's, Murphy's, they're in differing ways. What they have to say and the style in which they say it is so compelling that I think it really, they do come alive. And that's one of the issues with the book in general is that, I think Edward does come alive as an individual. Again, whether you like him or not, it's really irrelevant. But he certainly has a voice. He certainly knows how to express himself, and he has views, and that I think is troublesome.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I think we've got to draw out to a close. Thank you so much, Jane, for the rich discussion. Should you wish to purchase a copy of the book, there are some available there. Perhaps the author can give you an autograph, as I'm looking forward to very soon. And thank you for joining us at Imperial College.